2 years. That's all it took for the nationalist government to lose what had seemed like an unassailable advantage. In 1946, Chiang Kai-shek's forces had outnumbered the communists nearly 5-1, a crushing superiority that should have ended the Civil War decisively, but by late 1948, that dominance had evaporated. Both sides now commanded approximately 1 million soldiers, and their artillery count stood nearly equal. In his diary that June, Chiang had already written the epitaph for his own regime. The main reason our nation has collapsed time after time throughout our history was not because of superior power used by our external enemies, but because of rot from within. By early November 1948, all of Manchuria had fallen to communist forces. Almost half the nationalist army there had been captured or killed, hundreds of thousands of men and their equipment simply gone. Then Xinan fell, the final nationalist city on the Shantung Peninsula. Communist armies that had spent years fighting as guerrillas now demonstrated they could fight and win conventional battles. The nationalist defensive position had fractured into a fragile cross-shaped area along 2 railroad lines centered on the city of Suzhou. These railways were lifelines, but they were also chains. What the nationalists didn't know was that their operational plans were being delivered to communist leadership almost in real time. Major General Guo Rugui, Director of Operations within the Ministry of National Defense, was a communist agent. A later saying would capture the scale of the breach. What lay on Chiang's desk also lay on Mao's. While the nationalists relied on their railroad network, the communists were building a logistics system that required no tracks, no fuel depots, no vulnerable infrastructure. 5,400,000 peasants mobilized across 5 provinces. They came with 831,000 hand carts, push carts, wheelbarrows, and 2-wheeled carts. In villages throughout communist-controlled territory, hundreds of thousands of women organized to sew heavy cotton uniform jackets, make shoes, and grind grain. The numbers were staggering. 217,000 tons of grain transported across rural terrain. Nearly 700,000 mortar and artillery shells. Over 20 million rifle and machine gun rounds. All of it moved by human power along dirt paths that turned to impassable mud after rain, requiring 4 days of clear weather before normal traffic could resume. The nationalists had American trucks and air transport. They had tanks and artillery and an air force that controlled the skies unopposed. But their supply lines depended on railroads, and railroads could be cut. The communists had wheelbarrows pushed by farmers who had been promised land reform. Their supply network was everywhere and nowhere, impossible to interdict, impossible to destroy. General Chen Yi would later distill the campaign's secret. The victory of the Huaihai campaign was pushed forward by the people with small carts. The campaign began on November 6, 1948. General Chen Yi commanded approximately 500,000 communist soldiers converging on Huang Baitao's 7th Army Group, positioned east of Suzhou with 12 divisions. But the trap had been laid long before the first shot was fired. On November 8th, as Huang's columns began their withdrawal toward Suzhou, 23,000 nationalist troops defected, exposing the 7th Army's retreat route. The defection wasn't spontaneous. Communist moles within the Nationalist High Command had been spreading rumors for months to poison relationships between nationalist generals. The most devastating poison targeted Generals Chu Qingquan and Huang Baitao. In 1948, Chu had saved Huang's corps from communist encirclement in eastern Henan. But Qiu received no promotion while Huang was elevated to command the 7th Army. Communist agents exploited the slight, spreading rumors that destroyed any working relationship between the two generals. Now, with Huang's forces cut off just 20 miles from Suzhou, that engineered vendetta proved fatal. Chiang Kai-shek ordered Qiu's 2nd Army to relieve their beleaguered colleague, but Qiu refused to commit his elite American-trained 5th Corps to the fight. He feared encirclement, and he had a personal grudge against the man he was supposed to save. For 16 days, Huang Baitao's corps fought without resupply, while relief forces advanced slowly, cautiously, or not at all. The 7th Army managed to inflict 49,000 casualties on communist forces before being destroyed, a testament to their desperate fighting. But without ammunition, without food, without reinforcement, the outcome was inevitable. On the night of November 22nd, Huang broke out from his headquarters with his deputy commander. He had already decided how his command would end. Somewhere in the darkness, he took his own life. His deputy smuggled his body through communist checkpoints. The 7th Army, 100,000 men, had been destroyed in 15 days of brutal fighting. Du Yuming was one of the ablest strategists in the Nationalist army. When he arrived in Suzhou to take command, he could tell immediately that the military reports were falsified. Du also harbored a dangerous suspicion. Major General Guo Rugui's conduct seemed wrong. Unlike most nationalist officers who enriched themselves amid the national crisis, Guo was clean. Du presented his concerns to Chiang Kai-shek. Guo should be removed immediately. Chiang was furious. Du's reasoning seemed to imply that all nationalists were corrupt and only communists were clean. "I will never doubt a loyal servant," Chiang declared. The intelligence leak went unaddressed. Communist archives would later confirm the scale of the betrayal. The nationalists' movements, deployments, and withdrawal schedules were all known to us 3 days in advance. As Huang Baitao's corps was being destroyed, Huang Wei's 12th Army pushed northward from the south. His 12 divisions represented Chiang's desperate gamble to break the encirclement. But Guo Rugui had already passed the relief plan to communist commanders. By November 23rd, communist forces pivoted to envelop Huang Wei's advancing columns. The relief force designed to save the encircled became encircled itself. Then came December 15th. The 59th Army under Commander He Jifeng and the 77th Army under Commander Jiang Kexia did not break under fire. They did not scatter in panic. Instead, in a coordinated action clearly planned for weeks, 2,500 soldiers turned their weapons against their own side. Jiang Kexia had been a communist agent since 1929, 19 years of deep cover, rising to lieutenant general while reporting directly to Zhou Enlai. When the moment came, entire formations with their command structures intact crossed to the communist side. Artillery pieces that should have been supporting the relief effort repositioned to fire on nationalist positions. Only Huang Wei's deputy commander managed to break through communist lines, riding in an armored tank with 8,000 survivors, badly wounded in the escape. Huang Wei himself was captured alive. By late December, only Du Yuming's 3 Corps remained, the last organized nationalist force in central China, trapped in a shrinking pocket around the village of Chengguanzhuang. For weeks, they had endured encirclement, consuming their supplies, watching relief forces fail to arrive, because those forces no longer existed. Du came up with three options for Chiang: recall troops from other regions for a counteroffensive, wait for reinforcements, or break out independently. Chiang chose the riskiest option: break out. Then the weather turned. More than a month of heavy snowfalls descended on the North China Plain. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, unremarkable for northern latitudes, but the Nationalist army was comprised largely of soldiers from southern China, where 50 degrees was considered cold. They had no winter clothing for these conditions. The snowstorms grounded the Nationalist Air Force. The planes that should have been providing air support and supply drops couldn't take off. Inside the pocket, food and ammunition dwindled. Nationalist soldiers began slaughtering their horses to feed themselves. Communist forces recognized the opportunity and launched a propaganda campaign using loudspeakers and leaflets to offer food to soldiers who surrendered. About 10,000 did so, walking across the lines for a meal. Su Yu, the communist commander, presented surrender terms on December 17th. Du Yuming and his staff received them in silence. But the common soldiers began deserting en masse. On January 6, 1949, the Communists launched their final offensive with a massive artillery barrage. Under this bombardment, Communist troops seized villages along the pocket's edge. Du Yuming was caught completely off guard. He ordered his forces to hold position until the attack subsided, which was exactly what Su Yu wanted. The following morning, the attack focused on the village of Qinglongji. This triggered the mass collapse of the 13th Army, which by day's end had been reduced to remnants seeking shelter with the Second Army. Su Yu had estimated the battle would take a week. Du Yuming had effectively lost control of his own men. By January 10th, it was finished. Du Yuming was captured. General Chu Qingquan shot himself while trying to break out with his troops. Only General Li Mi managed to escape. The final tallies revealed the magnitude of what had happened. Total Nationalist casualties: 555,000 troops. Of these, 320,000 were captured, 171,000 were killed or wounded, over 63,000 defected or revolted. 80% of the Nationalist army that entered the Huaihai campaign never left it as Nationalist soldiers. 154 Nationalist generals above the rank of Major General were lost. The entire officer corps of the Nationalist army in central China had been decapitated in 65 days. Every piece of American equipment they had brought, the artillery, the tanks, the small arms representing years of military aid, now belonged to the Communists. Faced with this prospect during the final days, Chiang had ordered his own air force to bomb his own formations to prevent equipment capture. He killed his own troops rather than let them surrender with their weapons. When Stalin heard the battle report, he wrote in his notepad, "It is a miracle that 600,000 defeated 800,000. It is a miracle." On January 21, 1949, 11 days after Du Yuming's capture, Chiang Kai-shek resigned as president. The nationalist leader, who had dominated Chinese politics for 2 decades, stepped down because the army that sustained his power had been destroyed in the frozen fields around Suzhou. Nanjing, the nationalist capital, lay just 200 miles to the south, with no organized resistance between it and the communist armies. It would fall on April 23rd, just 2 days after the offensive began. How does a battle of this magnitude vanish from historical memory? Huaihai's 555,000 nationalist casualties alone exceeded the approximately 425,000 total casualties across the entire D-Day Normandy campaign. The 65-day engagement involved more troops than any Western battle of the Second World War. Yet decades later, Western military academies teach Normandy in exhaustive detail, while Huaihai remains absent from their curricula. The invisibility stems partly from timing. American military aid to the Nationalists had dried up before Huaihai began. Secretary of State George Marshall had concluded, "The present regime has lost the confidence of the people, reflected in the refusal of soldiers to fight." All U.S. aid was suspended on December 20, 1948, while the battle still raged. No embedded journalists transmitted dispatches. No American soldiers returned home with memories to share. The battle occurred in a theater the United States had already abandoned. But the obscurity reveals something deeper. The scale of defection and revolt represents a dimension of military collapse rarely seen in modern warfare. Entire armies changing allegiance mid-battle, generals leading their troops to the enemy, command structures disintegrating through betrayal rather than defeat. These phenomena challenge conventional narratives of how wars end. The Nationalist generals who survived and reached Taiwan remained bitter for decades. The spy who had doomed them, Guo Rugui, was labeled a traitor by the Communists during the Cultural Revolution and persecuted in political campaigns. On his deathbed, he left his family a blank sheet of paper as his will. His son explained, "Father said he wrote nothing because no words could absolve the debt of those who died because of him." Huaihai determined China's future, but it disappeared from the world's memory. The battle that erased an army somehow erased itself from history. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.